It's May 15th, and it is now, I think, about 10:02 or 03, I'm not sure. But we want to start off the morning with the Capital Improvement Program Year in Review and Year. And before we get started, something that I've been wanting to say for a long time. Sometimes when we come to the table, sometimes you give your first name, but could you start adding your title? Because I think out of respect, I would like for you to, instead of calling people by their first name, respectfully, if you have a title in front of your name, just let me know so I'll know. Okay, for example, you're a doctor. I never knew that. Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Nicole Stewart, Director of Facilities Planning.
I'm Cindy Smith, Director of Design and Construction.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Lynette Washington. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities and acting as COO.
All right, and this morning we'll be presenting to you the year in review and year forward for the Capital Improvement Program. All right, so this is just a brief overview of what we'll be going over today, including an update on the previous approved CIP projects, the state capital funding review for FY19, the 90% IAC recommendation for our funding for FY19, some of the CIP related legislative items that you've already received a briefing on, but we'll go through the relevant ones for the CIP again today. And then we'll talk a little bit about our priorities for FY 2020, and then just what the decision points and the remaining timeline is for the CIP.
So just to briefly go over the project status of our previous CIPs. These are active. This is a list of the active projects currently. We have 21 projects for FY18, 8 of which are still in consultant selection, and the rest are in design. For FY17, we have 12 projects, all of which are in construction award phase. So they're all in various phases of getting contracts signed or, that POs and that kind of situation. We are still working on construction of FY16 projects and 4 FY15 projects, with the rest of the active ones in a stage of closeout. In regards to our 2 major projects, Hollibird and Graceland Park O'Donnell Heights, we have contracts signed and are in the works to get those approved with the state to get POs to start to break ground. So the current occupancy date for those would be August 2020, with then construction demolition of the existing buildings and site finishing in January of 2021. Funding is in line right now with getting those all started, so we're all on track with those. And those are our 2 net zero projects, just to make sure that everybody's aware of that one.
And as you all are aware, our annual CIP allocation, we receive in increments. We receive 75% of the funding, then we receive 90% of the funding, and then 100% of the funding. And so they vote on those funding allocations over a period of time. Right now, we have received what the 90% recommendation is. And so when we say 90%, the total governor's budget is about $313 million, and so they've allocated the 90% of those funds. And so what's been allocated so far, about $282 million of those capital funds, and then about $11 million in our recycled contingency funds have also been allocated back to us. And so what remains now is about $31 million to be allocated from the state. That was supposed to happen on May 8th, but that date was pushed back to May 31st. So we'll know what the 100% allocation is at that time. And so what we've received so far for the 90% allocation, as I said, we received about $11 million in our recycled contingency funds. And just for the public, just to give them a reminder, so when we have to rescind projects for various reasons, those or return when we have to cancel projects for various reasons, those funds go into a dedicated account for city schools. And then what's happened in the past, how it's worked, is we have to then request those funds for particular projects in the next CIP year. And so that's what that $11.9 million represents. We've received about $27.8 million in just new authorization from the state. And then for this particular year, also new, is $12.8 million for what has been described as immediate threats. So any type of project that might have been affecting the health and welfare of students and their ability to maintain a building, we were allocated these additional funds for this year. And so,
That's what immediate threat is?
yes.
Oh, would you repeat that?
So the state came up, based on some of the things that happened in January, they came up with this additional funding that was then applied to LEAs based on whether or not they had buildings that had immediate threats. So whether or not it was an HVAC project or just something where they identified a project as just that we had already listed as in our CIP. They said, okay, let's come up with some additional money to apply so that they can make sure to move those projects forward.
Thank you.
And so right now, as of right now, we've received $52.5 million for 23 capital projects. Of course, that's always represents a fraction of our need. We requested 37 projects at $94 million, but of course, we are excited to have this amount of funding so that we can move forward our projects for this year.
Can I just add one thing, clarification? So just for the public, so slide 6 is talking about the amount that we've been awarded from the state out of the 90% of their allocation.
Yes.
Slide 5 is referring to the total state award
Yes.
pot. So I just wanted to make clear that for the public, and I think we should probably do some kind of annotation on that. It just occurred to me when I was looking at this time to make clear that that's the state award. That's not the amount we're getting. That's just the amount the state is awarding out of CIP dollars, just so you're clear. To all LEAs.
Right.
Yes, and so then slide 6 is telling you what share we're getting of that, but we should just probably
Yes,
footnote that just to
absolutely.
make that more clear.
Yep.
Is there any way possible, and because I'm really clear about what you just said, but what you just added made it even more clear. Is it any way, like you just said, you're going to do an annotated copy or something? Because things have gotten better for me to understand instead of the way you present. But a few things that come to question that if it was present, I don't know if it's a sidebar that would have to be put there, so I wouldn't have, or the public wouldn't have the question.
You're right. I think so. I think this is one where, again, I read this myself before we uploaded it. I just didn't think of it then, but for some reason, looking at it now in this context, I was realizing that if you didn't have the context that we all have and you just looked at slide 5, you might be thinking that that's the award to us, and it's not. So I just think we need to make really clear that that's the total award. So we'll update that slide.
And we can also include in the appendix of the presentation a list of the LEAs and what they've received so far that totals up to the $293 million across the whole state.
Right, ma'am, because before, I would say a year ago, I didn't understand everything, but I guess after I'm always asking these kind of questions, you made it a lot more clear. But when you added that piece, that sidebar, it even is better for me. And
for everybody.
And everybody.
It just needs to be, we should make more clear, so we'll fix that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and this is just a list of the type of projects that have been funded with that $52.5 million. So our two major renovation projects that Cindy Smith just spoke about, and then it includes 12 not window unit AC projects. What's the correct term?
Vertical packaged units.
Vertical package units, an elevator project, a fire safety project, 4 HVAC projects, and 3 roof projects.
Since you just highlighted that, can you talk about why the vertical package units are different than window units and why they're important?
So vertical package units, they're independent of the central air conditioning system. They provide for each individual space, and they provide both heating and cooling, and the ventilation that's required for code. So a window air conditioner cannot provide heating, and it doesn't provide the code required ventilation, whereas these units provide everything all in one. If one goes down, it doesn't shut down the entire building, it's just a room.
They're more energy efficient.
They are way more energy efficient than a window air conditioner.
Yeah, so we were really concerned with when we got the direction to be adding air conditioning across our buildings, which is a challenge because of the condition of our buildings, that one of the things was that if we added window units across the system, that it's going to have a major impact on our utilities bill. So these are much better in terms of energy efficiency. They're more expensive to put in initially, but because of the benefits of the ventilation that Cindy mentioned, the energy efficiency, and the fact that it deals with heating tends to be a bigger problem for us in terms of missed school days than air conditioning. So air conditioning is a problem too, as we will be finding out in the next few weeks. I mean, that's not ideal either, but heating tends to be a bigger challenge. So the fact that these address both those was very valuable to us.
What is the estimated cost to purchase and install one of these packs?
So it really depends on the infrastructure of the school, because the electrical system in all of the buildings tends to not be enough to support the quantity of units that are required, but that really depends on the school. For example, we have contracts right now in place to install them at Lakewood Elementary School, as well as the Northern Building with Reginald Lewis and Achievement Academy. That one requires a significant electrical upgrade, which triples about our estimate that we originally had in place, not knowing the electrical needs. But Lakewood, they're running about $15,000 a unit installed.
Yeah.
So it really just depends on the existing infrastructure. Mergenthaler is another one we have a contract in place for right now. It did not need an electrical upgrade, so it's running more around the 15,000 units or so. So it just really depends on the school.
So as you all also are aware, Governor Hogan also approved an additional $15 million for FY19, specifically for Baltimore City, to address projects related to heating and air conditioning repairs and upgrades. We're still working internally and also with our partners at the IEC, the PSCP and the IEC, to determine how those funds should be applied to projects. And this is just a list of some of the legislative updates that you've seen before that are related to the CIP. Of course, 21st Century School Facilities Act, which includes some of the recommendations from the NOC Commission that directly impact the CIP. So, of course, we're moving to a interagency commission on school construction to allocate CIP and approve CIP funds as opposed to the BPW. In addition, as I said before, the total governor's budget is about $313 million for FY18, but the intent is to increase that amount to about $400 million statewide for school construction. Systemics remain eligible. So there was some discussion previously about the CIP not addressing systemics and being used for major projects. So that is no longer the case. So systemics will remain eligible, which is important for Baltimore City. No partial funding for systemics unless an LEA requests partial funding. And so as you remember, there was a big issue in a couple of previous years with the state partially funding our projects and that impacting the projects that we had to then cancel as a result of receiving funding over 3 years for a systemic project instead of that funding one time. So that's been addressed with the legislation. In addition to the new allocation of recycled contingency funds, so no longer supplanting those new funds with recycled contingency funds. And there was one other item that Cindy should probably address.
Yes, so also now contractors, we can use, instead of having to use the flat-out low bid, we can use a best value practice when evaluating contractors. So if when we evaluate them, we feel that there's something wrong with the bid or, that can result in a lot of change orders afterwards, that does not necessarily have to be who we award the project to from now on.
Quick clarifying question. Because this was approved in the 2018 legislative cycle, does it impact 18-19 school year, or will it take a year for it to be in place to have impact?
It's July 1, it's when it's put in place.
Perfect, thank you.
Commissioner
Can you explain what the impact is to us on the removal of the Board of Public Works from the process?
So generally, every year when we would submit our capital improvement requests, the public school construction program, the interagency of school construction, would make a recommendation to the Board of Public Works, and the Board of Public Works would provide the final approval. So now, also during that process of when that recommendation is made, then we, the school systems, would go before the Board of Public Works and also provide our appeals. It was called the Begathon, where we would make the CEO, the school superintendent, would come before the Board of Public Works and make an appeal for our construction dollars. Now that the Board of Public Works is removed out of the process, they actually have representation. The interagency on public school construction is no longer just an agency, it's a commission where there's representation by the Board of Public Works. So the governor office and also the treasurer also has representation on this panel. The panel is the panel that actually makes the approval for the public, for the construction projects. So the public school construction program, again, will make the recommendation, and then this commission will review that recommendation and make the approval, instead of the approval being done by the Board of Public Works.
So it eliminates one action before the Board of Public Works. It's not multiple.
Exactly.
Right, thanks. Question generally, thanks. A while back, I think it was you, or no, it might not have been your team, presented, I guess, what it was called an equity analysis of how capital dollars were spent within the district. And I'm wondering whether that analysis is a filter that's still used in the allocation of capital dollars and how it was used in this allocation.
So one of the things that we use is an overlay in order for us to be able to assess and ensure that our impact is spread. But the first steps that we take is a prioritization process that is based on the condition of the asset or the system. And that's one of the things that actually guides. It so happens that a lot of our aging facilities and the aging systems are spread across the district. So it allows us to provide an overlay to see how our funding is reaching different pockets of the city based off of the equity analysis. But I would say that our first drive is the existing conditions of the system, because our dollars are limited, and a lot of our systemic projects that we target are emergency-related projects. So I would say that most of it is definitely guided by the conditions of the system, and then we provide an overlay after we've gone through our prioritization process.
Yeah, I don't know whether you have the mapping capability, but it would be useful maybe next year to see how that is applied against the analysis, the equity analysis that was presented to us, so we can see the allocation of these resources across the district.
And we can definitely do that. We do, most of our mapping is done in-house, so we can do that.
Thank you.
And we can provide that in the full board presentation so that we're able to
Great,
see
thank you.
how the projects are spread across the city.
That'd be great, thank you.
And I think that's a good addition to the full board, and I do think we've seen pretty strong distribution of programs across geographic areas in the city. And, you know, as Lynette was saying, the projects that we're doing are such a small part of the need that they really are dealing with the most severe cases, but those tend to be pretty well distributed among our schools.
As I said, lastly, the final recommendation from the IECs and BPW will happen May 31st, so that we'll have the 100% recommendation at that time. And that's all. Thank you.
Any questions, commissioners? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners Bodima, Hassan, and Frank, and Chief of Staff. I'm Sherry Vincent. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the 21st Century School Buildings Program, and I'm here this morning to present to you a request to amend the original enhanced approval package for Patterson High School. As you may or may not have been here at that time, in early, I would say spring of 2016, the original enhanced approval package was brought to the board and then ultimately passed all approvals of the other partners boards for Patterson High School. The budget at that time was for $95 million. It was ultimately approved and went into the final design phase and was well on its way to completing the end of that phase, which would be construction documents. Those documents were then placed on hold when it came to light that the Patterson High School site was next to the Kane and Lombard Superfund site. That had not come up during the feasibility study. I can't speak to why at that time. I didn't pick up the feasibility studies until Plan Year 2. However, as soon as it did come to light, there was concern on the part of the district, well, what did that mean to Patterson High School? And so we did a lot of investigation at the time. We discovered that the original Kane and Lombard site was discovered in the mid-'80s, and EPA conducted a full remediation effort at that time for the school, or not the school, excuse me, for the site next door. And then eventually it became a golf driving range. So just to look at the site today, it wasn't obvious that what its history had been. So out of an abundance of caution, wanting to understand what impact it may have on the current site, our current site, for new construction where we were planning to replace the Patterson High School. The district commissioned an additional environmental report, a Phase 3, as it is known.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry to interrupt you. I don't have this
We don't
on
have
my
this
screen,
document.
so I'm not able to see.
That document is, it's the last page of the board letter.
Here it is.
If you look at the board summary, I'm hoping that you do have that. The last page is that page.
Oh, this right here.
Yes,
Okay.
so since
Okay,
that was the
good.
pertinent page I had
Okay,
asked
good.
just to show that one, I apologize, I should have
Okay,
pointed
no, I'm
that out
good.
to you.
I just,
Yes, ma'am, no
Uh-huh.
worries. So at any rate, we had commissioned an additional environmental study. The findings of the study were such that the test results that were done did not indicate any contaminant readings that were above acceptable levels and would require any further action. The EPA and the Maryland Department of the Environment also weighed in and felt that the site was in fact secure and safe. However, because we were about to embark on new construction with a replacement school, there were opportunities that we had to investigate accepting other remediation suggestions that were made in that KES report. And those were ultimately determined to be all remediation efforts that we wanted to take at this time. They include a vapor intrusion mitigation system that would be installed beneath the foundation of the new school that would simply allow any vapor collection to disperse naturally. It's a passive system until or unless there were ever any need to make it active. There is a fan system that is also a part of that system that would then could be triggered so that it would be actively dispelled. Then we would also put a much heavier vapor barrier on top of the foundation, heavier than would be normal in everyday construction. And then thirdly, we would remove the top 12 inches of topsoil throughout the site and replace it with 12 inches of new topsoil that would be brought in from another location. So that in combination or in concert would then really ensure in our minds that we are delivering a site that is safe for our students, our staff, and our community for the life of the new school that would then be constructed. So in order to do those, to take those measures, and because of the delay that it has imposed on the school, we are asking for an additional amount of money in the amount of $16,505,288. And this page does show you how that number was arrived at. These were estimates that were obtained from the Maryland Stadium Authority. They go through and talk about the actual cost for those 3 remediation efforts, as well as the impact on the design, and then cost to extend the project itself to conclusion. So what we would be hoping to do, if in fact this amendment and budget request is approved, that would allow us to restart the very end of the development of the construction documents, completion of those documents, and then allow us to go forward right into construction for Patterson. I don't, oh yes, I do. I'm sorry, would there be any questions in regard to the items that are listed here? I can answer anything.
I'm going to ask you to do something for me that's probably highly unusual.
Yes.
In the process of me searching for the document,
Yes,
the beginning of what you said, I kind of got it all mixed up. You were talking about, it shouldn't take you but 3 minutes or
Yes.
so just to review the beginning of, you talked about, it was 2015. And
So-
I just want to be clear, because my mind is clicking back and forth when you start getting into the environmental piece of the, the soil and everything.
absolutely.
And I've, could you do that real quick for me?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So in spring of 2016 is
Right.
when the original enhanced approval package was, went before the board and was approved for the $95 million. It then went right into final design. That final design phase progressed right along until the fall of 2017, or somewhere in, I guess, the summer of 2017, when the information about about Patterson being next door to a Superfund site came back into the public view, and we immediately looked at what that meant, what would the impact be on our Patterson site, and we went ahead and engaged that environmental engineer to do that Phase 3 study. The Phase 3 study did not uncover any levels of contamination that were above anything that would be unacceptable at that time, but they did make some additional recommendations of additional remediation efforts that the district could in fact perform, and those are the ones that I enumerated earlier: the vapor intrusion mitigation system, the additional vapor barrier on top of the foundation, and then the replacement of the top 12 inches of topsoil throughout the site, where play fields, anywhere students would be walking or playing. And so at that point, that was fall of this past year. It took some time to get estimates on what the impact would be on the budget if we were to do all of those remediation efforts. And we also needed to understand in the district's mind, did it make sense to go forward with those efforts? And the ultimate decision was yes, it did, to ensure the safety of the site, and to then put that into place, we would need the additional $16 million. And so we went ahead and developed the budget, prepared that, came back to you today to have for your consideration of that additional amount. And so, and the only reason why I do include the what looks like the original, I don't know why this isn't advancing. Can I advance this to the next screen? To the next, there we go. I want to advance it to the drawings, please.
Okay, that's the last page on that document.
There we go.
I saw that.
Okay. So, there we go. All right, so the only reason why I include what looks like the original enhanced, large-scale drawings, we call them, all the floor plans, all of the digital renderings, these are what are reflected in the current construction documents. In other words, there was some concern on the part of the community that somehow the documents might have changed during this hiatus, where we were waiting to get the results of the study, and determine whether we needed to take additional measures and then to come back to the board. And Nothing has changed. So the construction drawings, as the community viewed them and as they participated in developing them, have not changed. This is exactly where they were when we paused, and would be the documents that would be completed when the project moves forward. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner.
So let's say worst-case scenario, 5 years, 10 years down the line, something is detected. Is that then the liability, responsibility of the engineering company who said that it would be safe for us to build this building, or where does that rest?
Well, it's a very good question. I can only say that the MDE and the EPA have sent it to us in writing, that they feel that the site does not even warrant these additional measures.
Would they be willing to go so far as to take responsibility if something came up? I mean, are they that confident?
Well, the site next door, the Superfund site itself, as you know, is monitored and controlled forever, basically. And so the potentially responsible parties are there every year and do the monitoring, and if there were ever to be any issue, they would be responsible. I am not an attorney, so I couldn't tell you if they would then be responsible if the containment that exists on that site, which includes a subterranean slurry wall and complete capping of the area where from which the drums were removed, if for some reason that were to have an issue, I don't, their responsibility extends based on what the original contamination, entailed.
So I know we've asked before, why not find a different site that we just know is safe? Can you remind the public why that's not possible, or why that's not our course of action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and you should chime in, Sherry, I just don't think that there is a site that would meet the size requirements for Patterson anywhere in that area of the city. The southeast is a very overcrowded part of the city. We don't have another site that would meet the size requirements for both the Patterson site as well as for the Claremont program. Also, this Superfund site dates back to the 80s. It has been there next to the building all this time. We have done regular monitoring of, and we have not, but there has been regular monitoring of the water in the water wells that are dug into the site and at Patterson. During that time, there has not been we have not been told of any problems with that. We did initial assessments, as Sherry said, at the beginning of this most recent environmental study to look at the water and the soil, and did not detect issues. It was water and soil, right? I have that right, not air.
Correct.
Yes.
Right.
And so we did those checks, and as Sherry said, I mean, we recently have been really meeting with the state environmental department, who feels strongly that we are going way above and beyond, that what we're doing is not necessary. So we've been trying to be really careful to pursuant to the concern you're raising, which is a legitimate concern that we have, which is that really making sure we're doing all our due diligence to make sure we're aware of what the risks are, and that we're doing above and beyond what we're required to mitigate those risks. So this is, above and beyond what the state thinks we should be doing, or what's required, and it's not. It wasn't recommended. It wasn't said that it was required by our own environmental analysis. They said that they think that the site should be safe. However, these were additional precautions we could take if we thought they were warranted. So we're going above and beyond to make sure that our students are safe.
Yeah, and I taught at a school that was built on a former Superfund site, opened about, 18 years ago now, and they lost 10 school days this year because stuff started percolating back up.
Yeah.
So the world turns.
Okay.
Yeah, I have several questions, so do your best just to be short so we can get through them.
Okay.
The first is, our site is not a Superfund site, and our
Correct.
site has no contamination on it, correct?
Correct.
Right, nothing has been found on our site
Correct.
that would cause any kind of need for remediation.
Correct.
So the actions we're taking is really to protect against what is next to us somehow permeating under the soil or somehow getting into our site, and the mitigation we're taking would prevent that. Is that correct?
That would
Right.
be the intent, yes.
And what I am interested in the removal of the soil.
Yes.
So the proposal is to remove 12 inches of soil in the fields and I guess all parts of the site that are not covered by a building. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
And what is the purpose of that if there's no detection of any contamination within that first 12 inches?
So again, it's very similar to what they did on the original site, and that is, they call it capping. It's simply, what they did with the original site was they went down with a concrete wall, and then they removed the topsoil, and then they capped it with that. So when you put 12 inches of new topsoil in, the intent there is that you're really putting fresh topsoil in. Anything that you would come in contact with would be new soil, and that's quite a dense cap to put on top of an area to prevent anything. It's really to give you clean soil to start with, but it would also prevent anything
But
from.
We're doing that, I
coming
guess
through.
your term was abundance of caution, because there's
Yes.
no contamination now within the first 12
Correct.
inches, right?
Correct,
So it's just as a matter of extra precaution.
exactly.
And then that looks to be like the largest cost. It seems to me that's the
Yes, it
biggest
is.
cost. And then I don't understand this 10 million of escalation. Is that unique to the remediation, or is that a cost we would have incurred regardless? Because the 16 million, 2/3 of it is 10 million, what's called escalation. Can you describe that?
So typically, if you think about how long the site has taken
Right.
to complete and how long it will take going forward, that is the carrying cost for actually quite a few things. You've got not only design issues, that's captured largely for Stantec and Skanska at the top, but you have other costs that are involved in carrying a construction site for a period of time. And this would not start potentially until this fall, or if we're lucky, it would start in the fall. If for some reason it can't start till the spring,
Right.
because winter sets in early and we're not through approvals, then we're still talking a 2-year construction
So if we
duration.
did no additional remediation, which we're not doing, we would still have the $10 million cost of the delay, correct?
It might be somewhat less because you've got cost of this
Oh, the
money
actual cost, yeah.
that, there's a trickle-down effect.
Right.
So it would eliminate some of that, but not
It's
all of it,
hypothetical.
no.
And my last question.
No, but just to your point, I think that's right, is that we already have a delay because we had to do our due diligence to check on the environmental safety. And so a large part of that delay is already in there. So, and there were delays prior to this, just to be clear. So I think that a lot of this escalation is being attributed to being part of this, that it's not necessarily associated with this particular issue.
And the last question, not necessarily to point fingers, but everybody knew there was a Superfund site over there next to the Patterson. I'm curious, do we have any idea how we designed a site without anyone's knowledge of being next to a Superfund site?
Not having been here at the time, I'm afraid I don't have.
I don't know the answer to the question. I'm sure at some point somebody in the school system was made aware of it. We did a feasibility study early on that did not flag it. One would think that if you were doing a feasibility study, that one of the things you might look at was to see if there was Superfund sites in the area, and it did not come out in that feasibility study. Again, the people who are here now in the school system, we didn't know that it was next door. I'm sure people did. I mean, it goes back to the 80s, so people did. But it belongs to the city. It does not belong to us. It's not on our property. We were not, again, people here were not aware of it, and we would have thought the feasibility study would have drawn it out, and it didn't.
Thank
Any
you.
more questions? Okay, I'm really concerned with this, really, really concerned, because all of the information that we're getting right now is similar information that happened in Fairfield. And I'm sure, I don't know if you're familiar with the Fairfield project in Cherry Hill going down to Fairfield. Through the years with chemical plants that started in the early 50s and building portable housing down there, and then Superfund stepped in, and they had lots of incidents of medical incidents of cancer, all kinds of activities going on down there, and the EPA stepped in. And if you go in your studies, you go to the legal documents, any legal documents, and you'll see all the information, how they had to move people out over a period of time. I'm impressed with the fact that they've done a lot of studies. I would like to see more studies done, because when I think about groundwater traveling through that area, and this Superfund place is so close to the school, and I'm not sure if I heard, when we talk about it, I'm not sure if I heard what type of chemicals were involved in the Superfund site, because
So there were a variety of chemicals.
yeah, I'd like to see those chemicals, because some of those chemicals are carcinogens, and some of them have a half-life span where it could go on for many, many years, can get absorbed through the soil and work its way up. And listening to, I don't know if you're using University of Maryland School of Environmental Science, if they're doing some of the investigations in the federal government, EPA, I think that you guys are on the right track. However, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the layers of soil that you put and the type of soil that you're using. And it sounds, and you said 12 inches and all that. It's certain chemicals will work their way up, and certain chemicals are not water soluble, and certain chemicals will work their way up over a period of time. We don't even know how long that will, how many years this will settle down at the bottom, and what type of chemicals. If they're right next to each other, it can work its way through the groundwater or through the soil. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just, since I've been here, I don't hear any scientific information. All I'm hearing is the Superfund is there, and I'm not hearing a breakdown.
So we can certainly provide the environmental analysis that the firm did who looked at it. So we can certainly provide that to you. I mean, I think, again, it was their assessment that there is no threat currently, but that if we wanted to take additional precautionary measures, that these were the ones that they would suggest, and or some combination. They didn't even say take all of them, take some combination of them. We're doing all of those things.
And,
so we're going way above and beyond what they, and then separately from that, again, the state EPA, the state environmental agency has said that we shouldn't do anything, that there is no threat and we shouldn't do anything. So we're taking every precaution that has been suggested to us, again, in an abundance of caution to make sure that we're ensuring the safety of our students and our staff.
And you know what? And I trust and I understand and I agree with you. But as a board member, to have few paragraphs talking about what's being done, for me, or I don't know, other board members, I am really curious to find out what their findings are. Because when we talk about X amount of money, X amount of millions of dollars, I am really curious to see what their findings are, some documents or something brief because I'm a chemist, and I will tell you that you can throw all that stuff at me any kind of way, but I know that there's certain chemicals that just don't disappear, and then there are some that can be abated. You know what I'm saying? So, and I trust that our organization, Baltimore City Public School, and the Department of Public Works, they have qualified, all these people are highly qualified, but as a board member to approve or to look at, to say, yes, let's go with it, and the public is listening, we're just saying, yes, okay, and without us knowing all the details.
So we can certainly, was the environmental study a part of the package? I just can't remember.
I think that if it hasn't been, it certainly could be made available on the website, or just, made available to you directly.
It's just an overnight, send it to me, let me look at it, and we're good.
And I just want to remind that this was a phase 3, so there was a phase 1 and a phase 2 that were done. The phase 3 was not a requirement. In other words, it's my understanding that the phase 2 did not say you need to do a phase 3. So, but we did. That was a decision the district made. That was not one that had been called for in the phase 2 environmental study. And I know that there are lists of the chemicals that were found on the site that we do have access to. And I remember having pointed out it to me that, yes, chromium was on the list, but it wasn't the chromium configuration that actually is a carcinogen. It was the non-carcinogen variety. So there were those kinds of information that we did have, and that certainly could be made available to you.
And I would say, and I totally appreciate it, and I'm almost 100% sure that everything is going well. I just know that when you come forward to give that presentation, it's always good, and I think I've said this before, to give more information.
Right.
Instead of what you're saying, it's a lot of pieces in between that, your information. And I'd just like to see it. And,
Okay.
you know, and
That's easy enough to
when you say
accomplish.
we've done this and
Yes.
we've done that,
Mhm.
I'd like to see what that is.
Okay.
You understand what
Of course.
I was saying? Okay, great.
Yeah. So-
Thank you. Commissioner Frank?
Let's see. I wonder, is the Superfund site now the driving range?
Yes.
And I'm always amazed how much Commissioner Von Diemen knows about stuff going on around the city, including Fairfield. That's
Oh,
remarkable.
it's in
So
the-
I was involved in the Fairfield project and the relocation of those residents, and there's reason to be concerned. I mean, there are some interesting parallels and there's some differences too, because all of that was the result of operating chemical companies that weren't leaving, and as a result, people were getting sick. So it was to move them out of way from existing companies that were going to be there for the next 20
So that
or
was
30 years.
not, Fairfield was not a remediated Superfund site at the
No,
time?
well, Fairfield is a community
Okay.
in which there were two residential clusters,
Okay.
and both of those residential clusters were relocated. Wagner's Point was one and Fairfield was the other, and the really reason was because it's the highest concentration of chemical companies in the city,
Okay.
and there was concern about those residents, but it was not a Superfund site. There was, but the one thing I bring a slightly different perspective, although I very much respect Commissioner Von Diemen's point of view. I bring the developer perspective or the public-private partnership of this. You can look at Harbor Point right now, where where the highest-end offices and retail and residents are now living on what was a factory that produced chromium.
Right.
It's still there. It will always be there. They're pumping it forever. They're regulating it forever. It got the same kinds of approvals that we got through the state and through the federal government. So it's not as if we're letting our kids go to school on a site that has any lower standard than people who are working and living and playing downtown Baltimore. I do think the groundwater is, it's a concern, but we don't use groundwater. So that's less of a concern, but it still should be something looked at. And I will feel better when the commissioner reviews the report.
Of course.
But in general, from the development perspective, I feel very comfortable that you hired the consultants to do what they do best and to come up with a recommendation, and you did every one of them. And I think we should do no less for our kids. So I'm very comfortable with the approach that you took.
So I really appreciate that, and I think one note on the groundwater is that you'll see in the study when you get it, that the groundwater is not flowing in the direction of our site, it's flowing in the other direction. So that's one thing that's very helpful.
We're uphill.
I didn't even know that,
Yes.
because it plays a critical role
That's right.
in the whole process. And
That's right.
and for all of us, we want to make sure that our families and the community knows that we are asking those questions so that when we can when we continue what we're doing, they can say that we really dug deep and we make sure that our children and our families and our communities safe. And I'm confident that everything's going to move, but I have to put it out there before looking at this. For me, and I'm sure others want to see the whole
Yes,
document,
that's right.
not the whole document, but guarantee that these
We don't
people.
want to see it, we just want you
Yeah,
to see it. May I- One last comment?
One last comment.
So, and this is not to you or to this point, but because it's on the table, once again, pushing us to think about these Patterson School with the Claremont program, rather than the Patterson-Claremont School having two separate schools, to once again isolate our students who are the most vulnerable and the most in need of being a part of a community. So, and you probably haven't heard my rant. I'm very challenged by having Claremont School and Patterson School located in the same building
Right.
while we're trying to give our kids as much equity as possible in engagement. So, looking to see it
I
be
presented-
Patterson High School with the Claremont program
Walter
located
P.
inside
and
of it.
Hartford Heights as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'll say it every time.
Thank you. How would you like those made available to you, just electronically, or?
Should publicly say that would
You
be
can send them through a new
wonderful.
board exec, Christian.
Yes.
And Christian, can you tell us your last name again? Thank you.
Perfect. I will
To
do that.
Mr. Gant, and he'll distribute
Thank
it to
you.
us. He's our new AJ.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Just
Welcome.
Christopher Gant.
Okay.
Christian, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I put you through so much this morning. Okay, thanks. You're the master plan.
We'll see. Good morning again, Dr. Nicole Stewart, Director of Facilities Planning. And this morning I'll be presenting our 2018 Comprehensive Educational Facilities Master Plan, or CEFMP. So what is our CEFMP? So every year, City Schools is required to submit our Comprehensive Educational Facilities Master Plan to the IEC on July 1st. And most importantly, what we should take from this is the CEFMP is really the main repository of all district facilities related, as well as program data across the district. And it's basically the tool by which we communicate what's going on in the district every year and what our current and future needs are. There are three components to the CEFMP. First, facility goals and guidelines. So every year in the CEFMP, we provide an update on whatever portfolio changes have happened, in addition to what program movement changes have happened. So as an example, our citywide programs like PAL or even our ESOL programs, we map those programs, their locations, and then we also the planning department also leads the program movement process every year. So we look at the distribution of our citywide programs, our early education programs, and then we assist those offices with making recommendations on where those programs should be located based on demand. In addition, every year we provide in the CEFMP a whole range of demographic and student-related data. So we provide information by community, so that could be a number of different data elements about the different communities where our students live, where our schools are located. And then we also, in the CEFMP, our office also does the enrollment projections, the 10-year enrollment projections that are also a requirement by the state. And then lastly, of course, our utilization plan is included in the CEFMP, in addition to just a review of our facility conditions that then directly connects to some of our other documents like the Comprehensive Maintenance Plan and the CIP, which are intended to all be aligned with the CEFMP. So what's new in the CEFMP for 2018? So last year we introduced the Community Conditions Index, which is basically an index that allows us to categorize our different neighborhoods across the city based on the different social and financial and asset investments across neighborhoods. And so what we've been doing is using that Community Conditions Index to then look at the distribution of our programming, distribution of our facility investments, and also dissect the different changes in academic performance of students based on where they live. And so this year we're expanding this equity mapping we've been doing into a particular chapter within the CEFMP, where we look at things like the distribution of our blueprint programs. As I mentioned before, we're involved in program expansions every year, and so we're mapping those program expansions by the Community Conditions Index, as well as an extracurricular activities survey we've been conducting, and so that'll also be included in the CEFMP this year, an intersection with the Community Conditions Index. And every year in the CEFMP also, we include information about enrollment trend factors, in addition to some of the community and demographic information that impacts our enrollment. And usually that doesn't necessarily make it to this presentation, but this year, in context of the different conversations that have been happening around the enrollment task force and some of the questions that have been asked over the past couple of months, I wanted to use this presentation as an opportunity to sort of provide some of the data that's in the CEFMP that we don't normally get to see in this presentation. And of course, we talk about the implications of enrollment on our district utilization, and then I'll talk a little bit about the tools we're developing to increase access to city schools data, and that's also available in the CEFMP. And so this is just one example of the equity mapping that we've been doing that will be included in the CEFMP. And so we created this Community Conditions Index, as I said, to really categorize the different neighborhoods across the city so we have a better understanding of where our schools are located and where our students also live. And so the basis for the Community Conditions Index, so we looked at factors that affect access, disparity, and stability, neighborhood stability. And so those particular indicators include access to healthy food, access to vehicles, poverty, median income, violent crime within neighborhoods, as well as the concentration of vacant homes in the neighborhood. And so we came up with this composite index, and we've been using it as a tool to really communicate how the equitable distribution of our programs and facility investments look like.
Do you think you can put those criteria on the slide just as a
Yes.
reference point?
Yeah, absolutely. And so once we came up with the index, so it goes from a range of what we've been calling low investment neighborhoods to high investment neighborhoods. And we've been mapping things like the location of our blueprint sites against that Community Conditions Index. So there'll be a whole chapter within the CEFMP with some of the analysis we've been doing over the past year or two to have that in one place, which we haven't had before. And I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of the presentation looking at some of the factors that impact some of our enrollment trends. So as you all are aware, we've experienced 3 years of significant enrollment decline. We've reached a peak at about school year 14-15, which is highlighted yellow, and we can see how that enrollment has changed over time. I thought it was important to just provide some additional context. So we've been hearing a lot of data, reviewing a lot of data around why this has happened, and so there were some remaining questions I felt that were being asked that I wanted to make sure we addressed, and I thought was important for you also to have access to. And so when we talk about enrollment in city schools, it's definitely tied to the larger population trends across Baltimore City. And so there was an article in The Sun, I believe around April, that talked about 5,300 resident decline between 2016 and 2017. And we can see that decline, we had a similar decline in the previous year. And those are, as you can see, definitely more significant than we have had declines in previous years. But I also wanted to break down that information because what we hear in the news is, okay, we have a 5,300 decline residents, and there's some, a little bit of pushback maybe when that information was presented, that maybe people aren't being captured in the city, that these numbers don't necessarily reflect what's happening with residential development across the city. But I thought it was important to also see the other side of that 5,300, when we dig into the numbers, that's really a net decline. So when we look at births and deaths, and then also international migration. So when we break these different pieces down, we're actually looking at about a 9,200 resident decline domestically. And then that number is then decreased by an increase in births over deaths, and then also international migration. So I say that all to say that it already looks extreme, and then when you dig into the numbers, it's even worse. And so just that provide some more context for what's happening in city schools. So in addition, there have been some questions that have been floating around about sort of where people are moving to and where they're coming from and who's moving. So I wanted to also address that. So the American Community Survey has a really great data set looking at the mobility of residents. So one thing I do want to caution is
Could we just
yes.
go back to that very important slide about enrollment?
Enrollment.
Yeah.
So this is just population. You wanted to look
That's,
at,
okay, that's what I was going to ask you.
okay,
The vital events, births and deaths, that's just population.
right, yes.
And natural increase means what?
So that's the number of births over the number of deaths.
Oh, okay. And then net migration is out of the city, in the city?
So we had domestic migration in terms of in the United States. We lost about 9,200 residents, but then we gained about 2,300 international residents.
In the United States? I don't follow.
So people who lived in Baltimore City who then moved to,
Somewhere else?
right, exactly, or came in from the United States. And so that represented 9,200
So-
net loss of residents within the United States. Within Baltimore City who came from or went to an area in the United States.
That's, okay, that's net. So we don't know
Yes.
how that breaks down, I guess.
We-
Are you saying, what, is there a number here that shows the number of city residents that moved out of the city? Is that the 9,200?
So those, they could have moved out of the city, they could have moved out of the state. Yeah,
Right.
so that's the net 9,200, exactly.
So 9,200 people, according to this, moved out of the city in
Right.
this year.
Right, yes.
And then it says international, meaning from another country.
Yes.
But where is the United States moving in? Where is someone that moved from Florida to Baltimore?
So that would be captured in the domestic number. And so.
So that's a net.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
All right, gotcha. But the international is in, I guess, a net too.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Okay.
And then adding those together, then you get the 6,900 total for overall net migration for the city.
Thanks.
So I do want to caution that this particular slide captures at the time period before we saw those extreme declines. And so this data is from 2011 through 2015, the 5-year American Community Survey estimates. But I think it gives a good snapshot of the types of movements that are happening. And so we can see that between those years, there was a net decline of Baltimore City of about 2,500 residents. And we can see that 2,500 comes from 35,000 coming in and then 35,000 coming in and then 38,000 leaving. And so when we drill down on who left, of those residents, 58% of them went outside of Maryland. 31% of people who moved out of Baltimore City moved to Baltimore County, and then about 11% moved to other counties.
What year did you say this was for?
So this is based on 2011, 2015, 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey. And so this won't capture the large decreases that we've experienced in the last 2 years, but it just gives some sense of where people are actually going and where people are moving to. And so you can see, we're losing the majority of residents to Baltimore County, but then in terms of where residents are coming from into Baltimore City, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel, and Prince George's County.
Commissioner Hassan.
And those are total residents, not students.
Residents. So we're just talking about
Yep.
population
Getting-
trends right now and residents. And then there's a question of who moves, right? So what I did was drill down on the people who moved across Maryland. So I didn't look at the people who moved out of state, but of the people who moved in and out of different counties across Maryland, looking at them based on income. And so the net line there shows that even though we're losing a number of residents with low incomes, there's a net increase of those who then come to Baltimore across Maryland, the people who are moving in and out of different counties across Maryland. But for the higher income residents above 75,000, we can see that there's a net loss of those residents based on these years. And then there's a question of, so the low-income residents or residents with incomes below poverty in Baltimore City. So what are their residential pattern. So the majority of them are continuing to live in the same house, and this is based on year over year. So the American Community Survey, they look at, okay, so what happened? So for the residents who live in Baltimore this year, where were they living last year? And so the majority of them are living in the same house they lived in last year. We have about 9% that are living in a different house in Baltimore City, meaning that's a number showing what the mobility pattern is for residents within the city who with incomes below poverty. And then we can see that about 3% are moving to a different county or a different state.
The blue would be different for the 25,000 and under and the 75,000 and over? Do we have any idea?
So if the blue
Whether
would
the-
be different.
Whether the
So
blue,
I actually did look at that, and so it is actually quite similar in terms of the residential patterns, except within maybe a percentage point or so, you might see the higher income residents moving out of Baltimore to a different county.
and living in the same house? I was just
Yes,
curious.
so it's,
That's pretty similar?
yes,
Okay.
so I believe it was about 83%. And so there was also a question at the last task force meeting about population changes across different neighborhoods. And this map just really shows across the different community statistical areas across the city where there are areas of increased population, which areas are stable, and which areas are decreasing in population. And so as you can see, pretty much the northeast area of the city is pretty stable. You have the most increase around the south and the southeast areas of the city. And then what we also did was then overlay that information with, of course, we're interested in overall neighborhood population, but what we want to know is about students, right? So we want to know, okay, you know, the shading on the map shows how population has changed, but what are the changes for how many students are living or school-age children are living in these areas? And so the red and the green highlight sort of the intersection of those two. So some of the green areas are those where you had the largest increases of school-age students, school-age residents in the community. And so I know this is a lot of information, and I'm available to break this down any way you want, but I wanted to make sure that we address these particular questions that did come up. And so the overall picture here is we're losing population in certain pockets of the city, but we're also increasing in other places. So that's just the context for how we then start to understand what's happening with enrollment trends across the city. And that's what this map represents. And so what we've been talking about before is neighborhood population trends. And so this is actual enrollment changes. And so these shadings represent the number of students enrolled in city schools who live in these neighborhoods. So the darker brown areas are the areas where we have the highest concentrations of city school residents. So as you can see, they're in West Baltimore, a lot in the southeast, and of course in the northeast, well, the northwest corner of the city, or the north corner of the city, we have the lowest concentrations of city schools residents who live in those areas. And then the overlay with this information is change. So even though in the west areas we have the highest concentration of students within city schools, those are also the areas where we're experiencing the most decline in students enrolled in city schools. So when we look
You can finish out.
So when we look at the change of students from school year 14-15 to 17-18, those are the areas where we're also experiencing the largest declines. And then in terms of where we're seeing increases, the areas that are highlighted green, it's important to note that those areas are majority flat in terms of increases in the south and the southeast, except for Orangeville, where we saw significant increases of students living in those areas attending city schools.
It would be interesting and to find out how the Baltimore City Police Department's data would overlap over this chart here to show where you show the decrease and increase to see the crime rate in those areas. And the community also would be interested to see Baltimore had, 16,000 abandoned homes?
Yes.
It would be interesting to see, to overlap that on that chart,
Mhm.
when we talk about the decrease and increase.
And so we have a little bit of that in our coming slide.
Okay, good.
Clarifying question, Dr. Stewart.
Yes.
I was reading the lowest decrease in students as that being the place where student population is maintained at the most consistent level. Am I misinterpreting that?
So no, it should be the highest decrease. Is what it
Okay,
probably
so then,
should
because
be.
I was looking at the highest increase being, of all those that are increasing, this one's increasing
The most.
the most. Is
Right.
that accurate?
Yes.
Okay,
And
so-
then for the reds, they show the ones who have shown the most decrease.
So that would, okay, so you might want to,
Sure.
Oh, that should be highest.
highest decrease.
Highest decrease.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
thank you.
I think that they're wrong throughout.
Because
Okay.
then I was being, yeah, okay, that's a very different interpretation than I was
Yes.
like, whoa. Thank you.
All right, so we'll fix that. And every year in our enrollment projections, we include, I'll move quickly. Okay. Every year, we include information about births. The thing that's important to remember here is that we calculate a capture rate. So of the births that happen within certain across the city, how many of that translates to the number of kindergarten students that are enrolled. And so what's important to look at here is that we had some of the highest capture rates when we had some of our highest enrollment in school year 2014-15. And that correlated to a capture rate of about 74%. But for this particular year, the capture rate has actually declined, where it's been pretty steady. So what that means is births have actually leveled off. They were experiencing a decline over time. They leveled off, but at the same time, we still have fewer kindergarten students enrolled, so we have a lower capture rate. And this is just what that looks like across the city. And then, so when we're looking at, what's important to note here is in some of the areas where we have the most births, we have some of the lowest capture rates in terms of northwest Baltimore. And then some of the areas where we have some of the lower births, we have some of the highest capture rates. So that's the important thing to take away from this slide. There was also a question about who does not attend. These are just numbers from MSDE about who attends private and non-public schools across the state. So about 10% of Baltimore, so there are about 127,000 students who attend non-public and private schools across Maryland. About 10% of those come from Baltimore. And then when we look at Baltimore specifically, there's just a breakdown of those 13,000 students who don't attend city schools or who attend public and non-private, where they fall and what type of non-public school.
And just for the public's clarification, publicly funded non-public schools are not charters.
Right.
They are things like JDC and separate day schools, correct?
Yes.
What?
Not separate day schools that are city schools.
No, but
Right.
like the Kennedy Kriegers.
Right.
Things like that.
That's
So
different.
I just didn't want the public to say, wait, we have more charters than that, because
No.
charters are publicly funded.
Nope.
But they are publicly
Oh.
funded public schools.
Gotcha.
And then this slide just gets into what is just an intersection of the different changes in in the number of students across neighborhoods by the housing market typology. And for those who might not be aware, the city's planning office, in addition to the reinvestment fund, every 3 years develops this housing market typology, just to really categorize the neighborhoods across Baltimore City into different housing markets, so that giving a broad summary of the kinds of changes that are happening within different neighborhoods based on the housing market. And so what I did here to try to address what Commissioner Bondima brought up is intersecting this enrollment information with some housing information. So we just looked at the year-over-year change for the number of students who are living in these different types of housing typologies. And as you can see, for the housing market typologies where you have sort of steady sales and low vacancies, we've actually that's pretty flat in terms of the change in the number of students enrolled in city schools who live in those kinds of areas. But as you can see, the highest percentage or the highest loss of students is within those stress communities that have a lot of vacancies, that have a lot of turnover, that our most challenged neighborhoods in terms of housing market, essentially. And so this is just a snapshot using just this year's housing market typology. We received a grant to work with researchers at Johns Hopkins, in addition to the city planning office, to look at this more deeply and more in depth. And so that was just a high-level summary of doing that intersection. So we received a seed grant from the 21st Century Cities Initiative to look at this relationship between enrollment and housing market trends a little more deeply. And what we hope, and what will come out of this is, the recommendations that will come out of the enrollment task force. This will provide us a way to think about how those different strategies can then be applied to how those different strategies can then be applied to different neighborhoods that are experiencing different school changes, demographic pattern changes, and housing market changes across the city.
Dr. Stewart, in the interest of time, I know you know how to do this. Could you move it a little bit quick?
I'll go through it. And so our enrollment projections summary, so just based on, so all of that was to say that our enrollment is decreasing. A lot of these are factors that we can't necessarily control. And what we're experiencing as a result of this decrease is then a resulting decrease in our enrollment projections.
A comment from Commissioner Frank.
Well, my comment is, it's great to see the analysis relating to the housing market, and that is sort of the intersection of schools and the rest of the city and what happens in neighborhoods. I think it would also be great to see on a more qualitative level the degree to which we're making decisions about our capital program that relate to other kinds of activities that are happening in neighborhoods, whether it's Inspire, and I'm not sure exactly where that process is, but to the extent that our investment in a neighborhood, or we choose to make an investment in a neighborhood because of what's happening immediately next to it or across the street, or there's an investment in a rec center, or there's demolition of an entire block of dilapidated housing that helps support our investment. I'd like to see that somehow. You don't have to respond now because, as the chair said, we're running late.
Sure.
But if you could just think about that, and I'm happy to think about it too, and how we can incorporate sort of the more micro, not in a presentation, but how we can incorporate the micro analysis that happens in neighborhoods about where we invest our capital dollars.
Okay, sure. And so essentially, because we've experienced these declines over the last 3 years, our enrollment projections reflect that, because our enrollment projections are based on a 3-year trend. So what we did this year is take into account what we don't know, so what results then is a trend that looks drastically different than what we think will actually happen. So since we're using those last 3 years, the decline over the next 10 years looks very drastic. So what we did was, we don't really know what we've been calling the floor. We don't know whether or not these drastic decreases will continue, and we don't think that they will to the extent that they have happened in the past 3 years. So what we did was think about the different the policies and initiatives that we're working on, and then we applied a factor to that, to the enrollment projections this year. So this is also just a slide showing the impact of the births and the enrollment trends. And the takeaway from this is what's really impacting our enrollment projections is not really the births. If we had a higher births or births were steady going forward, the enrollment projections will be about the same. What's really impacting us is this 3-year trend of decline. The utilization report, really quickly. So of course, based on the MOU, we calculate our utilization every year, and we develop a utilization plan looking at projected utilization as well. We have targets for currently 1920 for our targets are 86% looking at buildings without swing space and 80% with buildings with swing space. But as you can see, because of these enrollment challenges, it's really difficult for, no matter how many buildings we close or the decrease in the number of seats that we've been doing as part of portfolio, it's going to be particularly difficult for us to achieve these targets because of the enrollment declines. And so we're in conversation right now with the state to revisit some of these utilization targets. I won't spend too much time on this. I'll just say we're currently at 83% without swing space, our utilization. And this slide was just to emphasize the fact that I said that our enrollment decline is really impacting our utilization. So between last year and between 16-17 and 17-18, while we decreased the SRC, which is the number of seats, by about 3,000, we also experienced a 2,200 student decline in the buildings that we own. And so that's just to demonstrate that even though we're continuing to decrease our SRCs, our enrollment continues to decline significantly over the past 3 years, and that just lends itself to us not being able to meet that target. And the last thing I'll just say is when we initially started this, of course, we had projections, enrollment projections that indicated we will be at about 89% utilization at the 1920 target. And based on these enrollment changes, we're not there, and we won't be there. That's the gist. And we'll just, to Commissioner Frank's point, some of this is doing some more in-depth analysis and also providing some tools so that people will be able to access the data in the CEFMP themselves and do intersections of different data items so that they can, assist in doing some storytelling, and so they have a better idea about what's going on across the district and how changes in Baltimore are impacting the district.
Okay, Ms. Stewart, I'm going to have to say
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
it.
That was wonderful, and we're going to move on.
Yeah, that's fine.
Anyone who would like to review it, the public can always go to Board Docs
Yes.
and review it, and if they have questions, they can always contact
Email
you.
board,
Email.
email board at BCS, or Dr. Stewart's
Mhm,
contact.
mhm. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Started, it was, well, no, but I'll go ahead and get started. I had a question.
Okay. Good morning, members of the board. I'm Jeff Parker, Director of Procurement. The first contract before you is the district's membership dues as it pertains to the Maryland Association of Boards of Education. The cost for those dues is $41,089. The next procurement item. It's a 3-year contract, the estimated annual amount of which is $120,000. The contract is to help us clean out and remove outdated and damaged instructional materials from the schools. Does the board have any questions regarding this item?
No,
Thank you. The next procurement item is a 3-year contract with 2 one-year renewal options. The estimated annual amount of the agreement is $435,000. This contract is with the City of Baltimore to provide printing, logistics services, as well as inventory of a number of our forms and documents. The next procurement item is a 5-year agreement, the estimated annual amount of which is $1 million. This is with 7 vendors to furnish and deliver sustainable and non-sustainable cafeteria products.
and you can just get that answer to me. And this is probably something you already know. For the cafeteria, the sustainable and the non-sustainable items, that's just paper goods, things like that?
Correct. Some of, yes, like some of the non-sustainable items would be like the utensils
Yeah.
that you distribute, but I believe 13 of the 27 items pertaining to this contract are for sustainable, recyclable type of products.
Okay. excuse me, this is where the question that I had, and it'll save us some time as well. For Cole Roofing all the way down to Nicole's contracting, all of those were procurement that was approved in 2000, approved by the board in 2016.
Correct, they were fiscally approved.
Huh?
They were approved as part of the CIP budget
Uh-huh.
at that time.
So all of these that we're looking at right now,
Mhm.
if they were approved at that time, they have been, I'm just
Sure.
trying to get clear on it. So nothing has occurred with any of these?
So Cindy Smith, Director of Design and Construction. So at this time, what it means is, so they were fiscally approved in 2016 in that. So then they had to be designed, awarded, and this is the procurement of the contractor to actually award, to start the construction of the project. So the contracts for each of the individual projects have to be, approved by the board then, before we can go forward with them.
Mr. Hassan has a question.
So when they were originally approved, were they approved as a list of on-call companies? And this is what the on-call looks like?
So when they were approved, it was a list of projects included in the CIPs. It's very similar to the CIP presentation we just did. It's that list of projects, would have been 2 roofing projects, 3 HVAC, 2 elevators, whatever that was back in 2016. And then with amounts that were that we were waiting for the state to then allocate to us. At this time, this is then the contractors. These are all publicly procured. None of these are on calls at all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
In the sake of time, does the board, so all of these projects, 13-1 through 13-6, Cole Roofing, the 2 Chilmars, Cole Roofing, Chilmar, and Nichols, all pertain to either fire alarms or elevators or roof replacements. They were all publicly solicited. They're all compliant with MBE. Does the board have any specific questions? If not, we can move on to Walter's relocation. All right. Great. No worries. The next contract is to extend a competitively bid contract with Walters Relocation, RA Movers, and Apple Transfer to provide moving and hauling services to city schools for a period of 1 year. The next contract is with Colossal Contractors, Arundel Builders, JLN Construction, and Roy Kirby and Sons to provide multi-trade renovation and repair services to city schools. This is a request of the board to exercise the first of 2 one-year renewals for this contract. The next contract is with Colossal Contractors and CNN Associates to provide gymnasium renovation services. This is also a request of the board to exercise the first of 2 one-year renewal options regarding the agreement. The next agreement is with John W. Bronner Contracting. Specifically, this too is to exercise the first of 2 one-year renewal options. Bronner will provide major structural and renovation and repair services on an on-call basis as required by city schools.
Can I go back to Colossal? I was searching while you were talking. How many schools are involved in that contract?
The renovation contract,
Mm-hmm.
it would be all schools.
All schools, okay. Thank you.
Pretty much all of the contracts we bring before the board pertain to all schools, all departments. Sure.
Could you just say all schools? Or did it say that?
No, it doesn't say that.
Okay.
I'll make the
Because
change.
I think, don't you think it's a good question? Because sometimes you might be just doing 10 schools or 20 schools, but when you talk about large sums of money, it's always good to say all schools.
Noted. The next contract is with BMS Cat Incorporated. The estimated annual amount is $100,000. They are hired by us to provide cleanup and restoration services, typically due to fire and water damage. And then the last contract for the board's consideration is an increase to an existing contract to Cintas to provide employee uniforms and services. The increase is from $250,000 to $305,000. These uniforms are provided to school cafeteria personnel as well as maintenance. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, to everyone listening in. This is the end of the Operation Committee meeting. Our next meeting will be June 19th, 2018. The topic will be 21st Century Schools Update. If ever you have any questions or want to review some of the documents, you can go to Board Docs and review the documents. And thank you very much.
Thank you.